The worst thing I could say about Sir Clive Sinclair, a quirky if generally likeable guy, was that he wasn't good at business. That's it really. You call something the real Sir Clive, but, well, the real person's a pretty good guy. Now there's no need to call this one the real Jack Tramiel though. You know what this guy's all about. Again, we've looked at him a couple of times in videos, Specky vs C64 again, the Amiga vid, but I want to do a full profile. The most ambitious, the most driven, the most brutal. Even a picture of Tramiel is enough to strike fear in your heart. Imagine having to walk into a room, having to sit at the end of a table with him at the other end. You know it's not going to end well. So Tramiel's getting his time in the sun. We're going from the beginning all the way up to his Pyrrhic victory in the Great American Micro Wars. Now there's no denying it, Jack Tramiel had it rough growing up. He was born an only child to a Jewish family in Lodz in Poland in 1928, and during World War II he and his family were moved from the Jewish ghetto to Auschwitz and then to Arlem, where his father died, likely killed by a gasoline injection. Tramiel himself was examined by Josef Mengele. Now I can't possibly imagine the effect that it has on a person to spend their formative years in concentration camps, so I'm not about to try. All I will say is that Tramiel spent a large part of the rest of his life giving talks about the Holocaust across the country, and he was a founding supporter of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. After the war and liberation, he married Helen Goldgrub, herself a survivor of Belsen, and emigrated to the USA in 1947, aged 18, joining the army in 1948. This was where he would learn to repair office equipment. After 4 years, he left and with a GI loan set up a repair shop, Commodore Portable Typewriter, in New York. This didn't work out, so at some point he moved to Toronto where, in 1955, he set up Commodore Business Machines. Initially they imported and sold Czechoslovakian typewriters. This business did last, but not without some pretty rocky roads. Commodore's first bout of notoriety might not seem interesting, but it is quite important. In 1965, CBM were caught up in the Atlantic Acceptance scandal. It's a whole load of financial stuff, but basically, one of Canada's biggest savings and loan companies fell apart, and a big cause of that was financial corruption. The head of the company, C. Powell Morgan, amongst a myriad of dodgy deals, had several shady agreements with Tramiel, because they were friends. Oh, and also because Morgan was the chairman of CBM. It is also quite possible that Tramiel tried to obscure the inquiries and various trials that fell out from this mess by altering documents and lying under oath. The scandal was huge, one of the biggest financial scandals in Canadian history, and a fair few people associated with it went to jail. But not Tramiel. As convinced as the authorities were of his guilt apparently, they lacked evidence against him. Powell Morgan himself, the man at the head of it all, died of leukemia in 1966. Such a scandal could have been the end of CBM regardless, of course, if not for one man's intervention. That man was Irving Gould, a very rich financier, someone who'd had his own dealings with the courts in the past, and who'd made his money from distribution, shipping containers and the like. And yeah, he's just quite mysterious, especially when it came to the accumulation of cash. For whatever reason, he saved CBM. His financial support replaced the bad money from Atlantic that was propping up the company. Gould injects the money, becomes the new chairman of the board at CBM, and Jack Tramiel, whether he likes this or not, is now in Irving Gould's pocket. For all Tramiel's hills and valleys to come, Irving Gould will always have it over him that in 1968, he saved his ass. Tramiel would move his business to California in the same year. For the next few years, Tramiel works like a dog. He spent every day of his working life working as if the whole balloon could burst tomorrow. If necessary, he could go to Gould and ask for more capital, although the answer more often than not was no. Gould had too much interest in other things to care enough. Several expensive homes, a massive yacht, jets and so forth. Seriously, the guy was stupid levels of rich. You might wonder if he knew about anything at all, but he certainly did know something about one thing: tax law. This was how he got Commodore incorporated in the Bahamas, even though the company had nothing whatsoever to do with the Bahamas. When you're Gould, you get to become an expert at ensuring you have as much money as possible, I suppose. One part of this is bending tax law to your will, and another part is making sure that Jack Tramiel stays hungry, for that way he stays vicious. For a few years, CBM thrived in the calculator business, which was where Tramel's true qualities as a businessman first shone: his brutality. He lived by a famous three-word credo: business is war. The most naked admission in many ways of what business truly is. Tramiel revelled in destroying his competition and pricing them out of the market, in setting suppliers, retailers against each other and then screwing both of them. It was his absolute passion. Basically, Jack Tramiel was a very, very good businessman. I would like to stress he is, according to a lot of people's personal accounts, a very good guy, affirming, friendly, gregarious, charming, so long as you're in his good books. Trouble was, no one could figure out how to actually stay in Tramel's good books for all that long, and as soon as you weren't, well, you were an enemy, someone to terminate with extreme prejudice. In a way though, you almost admire it. Tramel's drive is supernatural. Not necessarily motivated by the accumulation of cash, but a desire for conquest, to be a king sitting on a blood-red throne. This all worked out well until an even bigger fish came along: Texas Instruments. Already a huge company primarily thanks to defense electronics and military applications, their movement into consumer electronics in the 70s would be decisive and dominant in the US. They started selling calculators and the like, and in doing so, virtually wiped CBM out. They could outmatch them in every department, primarily because they could make all the chips themselves, whereas CBM was still reliant on supplies. So there was simply no way that CBM could match them for price. Texas Instruments routed them all across the field, sending CBM into full retreat. Another important event for several reasons. Tramiel was on the brink again, and in 1975 he had to go back to Gould, who, for a second time, had to put his hand in his wallet and prop the company up. A bad experience for Tramiel, undoubtedly, as the pocket he's in gets ever deeper. Secondly, he would use a part of that capital to buy the chip-making company that would take CBM into their next evolution, MOS Technology. And thirdly, he would never ever ever forget this. Texas Instruments had almost driven Jack out of business. He was left beaten, bloody and scarred, but not dead. And as Texas Instruments would find out, if Jack's not dead, then he's gonna come back at you forever until one of you is dead. Maybe until everybody is dead. MOS Technology, like Commodore, were somewhat down on their luck in 1976. A lot of their revenue came from designing integrated circuits for calculators, and that too was scuppered heavily when TI came into the calculator market using their own chips. Before then, MOS had already laid the groundwork for the future of home computing. A team of 8 ex-engineers from Motorola, fresh off of creating the Motorola 6800, came to MOS looking to improve further. The most famous of whom, and one of the single most important people when it comes to the rise of the personal computer, was a man named Chuck Peddle. Peddle and his all-star team of engineers, a more talented group of which you're not likely to find anywhere, created their most important work in 1975, the MOS 6502. It was a true leap forward. It was more powerful and just as featured as every other microprocessor on the market. And also it cost $25 at a time when other processors cost $300 abouts. The 6502 is one of the most important chips of them all. You can find it or variations of it in the Apple II, the Atari 2600, the Atari 800, the BBC Micro, and the NES. And ultimately the Commodore PET, VIC-20 and 64. It's a pretty important chip, in other words. This brilliant little chip, one that Peddle would take all over America, gave MOS their name, but then Motorola came along with a lawsuit. In reality, MOS's team hadn't copied anything from their former company, but the low level of understanding of these brand new chips in the legal world gave Motorola all that they needed to win and hit MOS with punishing fines. The only comfort being that MOS were able to sacrifice their inferior 6501 chip to the lawsuit as opposed to the 6502. Commodore, already one of MOS's customers and desperate for the vertical integration that was needed to challenge TI, purchased MOS with the added condition that Chuck Peddle would join Commodore outright as their chief engineer. The deal, the most important one Commodore ever made, was carried out with typical Tramelian ruthlessness. Essentially, he withheld payments from MOS until they could make enough profit to swoop in as their saviour. and this was achieved with the help of the man over at Commodore UK, Kit Spencer. The deal cost Commodore less than $1 million. It was a bargain for a whole chip company. Jack Tramiel is very good at getting deals, you see. A brief word perhaps on just what made up Commodore at the time. For an American company, their success had actually come mostly in Europe at this stage. It would take until the arrival of the VIC-20 for them to really make a massive impact at home. But this is a video about Jack Tramiel, not Kit Spencer. The parent company was Commodore International Limited, created by company chairman Irving Gould and running out of the Bahamas. From there they had divisions all over the world: Germany, UK, Canada, Switzerland, Japan, Hong Kong. All of these largely ran without much interference from Tramiel, with their own general managers. People like Kit Spencer, Tony Tokai of Japan, mostly famous for the VIC-1001 and Max machines, and much later David Pleasance of Commodore UK. The US division was CBM, because that was run by Jack Tramiel with Dick Sanford as his then underboss. Now you may think I'm over-egging the cake with a mafia comparison, but Jack used to call the 20 or so people who he was closest with in the company the inner family. A circle of people from all over Commodore's empire, all in different positions who Jack considered friends and who benefited greatly from that. Jack only truly trusted these people and his sons. It's a huge company, in other words. As a general rule of thumb, the US operation is a bit of a madhouse due to all the micromanagement and general brutality that's going on. But the other worldwide divisions are relatively stable and usually functioning successfully. They're normal in all the ways that CBM aren't. As such, they are mostly not the subject of this video. This is mostly all about CBM. So when I speak of some kind of Tramiel person screwing atrocity, as I will often, you can assume that largely the opposite of this is happening in other territories. There are many bad things about Tramiel, of course. He'd make decisions on a whim, he was actually fairly easily influenced, and he could be brutal. Although never too personally. Almost everyone who actually worked with Jack says that while he's got his bad side, you want to work with him. You would never trust anyone in the trenches more, that his drive was inspiring, his will to succeed unmatched. A favoured and probably apt comparison is the one to General Patton, the one who lived and breathed war the most. Jack did not tolerate bullshit or incompetence, but especially the former. Trying to bullshit Jack never worked, and the usual result was a Jack attack. Think Gordon Ramsay. You are shouted at for a lengthy period, usually with the door open so everyone else can hear what an idiot you are. Jack breaks down every single thing that you're doing wrong, and at the end of it you respond. It's basically a test. If Jack appreciates that you won't screw up again, you'll probably get away with a punishment tour. Jack likes to send people on months-long tours all around Commodore's empire, away from their families, doing unimportant jobs away from the action. If your response is weak, an excuse or a desperate justification, well, you're fired on the spot. Many people, mostly managers, didn't survive their first Jack attack. The revolving door at Commodore was in management. Regular engineers were usually quite safe, but management? Well, the story used to go like this. Guy tries to get in with Jack, does so, gets assigned a management position, screws up, tries to hide it, gets Jack attacked, gets fired. Repeat ad infinitum. Jack attacks were so famous that some wags actually named a game after them, which you're seeing here. Jack himself was apparently quite amused by that. So it takes quite a strong stomach to go to him face to face and tell him that everything needs to change, especially when he surely desires to remain in calculators and defeat TI at their own game no matter what. But Chuck Peddle? Well, he was no shrinking violet himself, and that's exactly what he did. He went to Tramiel and convinced him that calculators were basically a dead end and that the home computer was the next big thing. He'd already produced a fairly successful and very early micro, the KIM-1, just before Commodore's acquisition of MOS, and Commodore were now selling these at an acceptable rate. While reluctant and not ready to get rid of the calculator business quite yet, Tramiel agreed to let Peddle have a shot at the computers. Now my reckoning is that Tramiel was no fool. If home computers were the next big thing, as Peddle said they were, then Texas Instruments would surely be in there before too long. He wanted to be there before that, and to be ready for them. Call it the second front, the micro theatre. Of course, by this time Tramiel had already somewhat developed a terrible reputation for himself, and Commodore were already regarded as a bunch of disreputable blackguards. As a result of this, Peddle's all-star MOS 6502 team was torn apart, primarily because most of them had no desire to work for Tramiel. And CBM was still perpetually short of cash, with Gould unwilling to inject any more. No matter. In Peddle, CBM had the first of many genius engineers under their belt. His team's computer was one of the first highly notable and popular micros out there, a part of the so-called Trinity of 1977 with the Apple II and TOS-80. Here it is, Commodore's most beautiful machine, the none more 70s Commodore PET. An evolution in many ways of Peddle's previous KIM-1, with a glorious monitor, keyboard and dataset that make it a masterpiece of integrated design, that metal case. The PET is a true computer of tomorrow, the most sci-fi computer ever, with all the obvious allusions to 2001: A Space Odyssey you can eat. It deserved to sell millions, which it didn't. Of the Trinity of 1977, the PET was announced first, came out last, and sold the least. But it still sold plenty enough to make an impact. As a computer, well, these days there's not a whole lot you can do with it. Only a few games, not a lot of memory, a mere 4 kilobytes at first, although this would grow. But, you can still certainly learn to code on it, and plenty of people did. It made a lot of waves over here too, where the PET was quite possibly the first computer to be at least semi-common in educational and business establishments. Commodore were already quite known over here for their calculators, which were very successful. They already had a distribution network over here, whereas Apple and Radio Shack did not. For us, the PET is pretty close to Genesis, the point where the home computer arrived. And so, while Commodore were faced with stiff competition in the States, they started to sink their claws in the European market, particularly here in the UK, and especially in what would become the home of Commodore in Europe, West Germany. Another big thing to note about the PET is the deal that Commodore made with Microsoft for a version of their BASIC that could be put on a ROM and integrated into the PET. A good thing seemingly, as it would make the PET's BASIC considerably harder to steal, which everyone did back then when it was on disk. Bill Gates himself was not a fan of the idea because he thought the ideas behind the PET were a load of rubbish, and basically hand-waved it away. Do whatever you want, just go away, because it's gonna fail. And so Commodore made a quick fixed price deal with Microsoft. Unlimited usage of that BASIC for any Commodore-made 6502 based computer. Forever. What a deal, huh? A frequent example given of the tightness of Jack Tramiel is that he stuck with this original deal for years, never updating the BASIC. But then with a deal like that, you could see why. After all, getting an update off of Microsoft would mean renegotiating it. And while the cost of the deal has never truly been revealed, it's known to be a spectacularly low amount of money, as little as $10,000. The BASIC in every Commodore computer unit up to and including the C64 cost the company less than a penny to include. Presumably Jack Tramiel would never let Bill Gates forget just how big a win he got over him here, something that very few people would do again, although the initial meeting was Peddle's and a lot of the intricacies of the deal were down to Commodore's then head of engineering, André Soussan. The PET goes down in history as the computer that sold the least of the 1977 Trinity, but that mostly had to do with the computer limping out of the gates thanks to Irving Gould being tight with the purse strings and not giving the money needed to increase production to a level that met the demand. Basically, every PET was hand-assembled. Besides, the TOS-80 was never not going to be number one, it's in stores all over the States. Initially, the PET made a big splash at computer shows all over the country, with Peddle as the master salesman, selling the computer for a brilliant Tramiel strategy. Give us a check for $795 and you get an 8K PET within 90 days. If you don't get it in that time, you can ask for your money back. This injection of funds was necessary as the company was still really struggling financially at the time, and although a lot of people ended up having to wait 6 months or so for their computer to arrive, the company was still making money. The consumer does actually still have to make that decision to forget about it and get their cash back, which they're not necessarily going to do on day 91. Indeed, apparently no one did. Peddle is, of course, the superstar here, a fantastic engineer and salesman, the sort of person you have to take a photo of to prove that they exist, But credit certainly goes to Tramiel also for getting fully behind the computers, and his plans that at the time pretty much saved the company again. It wasn't all down to Chuck, although most of it certainly was. As awful as Tramiel can be, he is very good indeed at what he does. And so Commodore had made their first splash in the world of computers. They'd arrived and they'd certainly made a mark, a little one in the US and a big one in Europe. They also had their own chips, which, as it turned out, loads of other people wanted. When Apple or Atari want more MOS 6502s, they have to go ahead and talk to Commodore. Ergo, their success also benefits Commodore. They may not be upgrading any of that now that most of the team's buggered off, but they're sure as hell selling it. They are a firm and important part of the burgeoning home computer business, and worth quite a bit of money. So what would the man who some have even credited with the invention of the personal computer, Chuck Peddle, be rewarded with for this success? Well, gradually he got Tramielled. The relationship between Jack and Chuck was always tempestuous, and he'd already quit the company once before 1980 to go to Apple. Over time it would gradually sour more and more thanks to various events, talk of company reorganisation misinterpreted as mutiny, and a general pulling in different directions. This will be a common theme, because Tramiel's just that sort of person. The sort of person who takes no one being bigger than the boss to an extreme, who doesn't truly see the good in anyone. If someone's becoming successful and making a name for themselves, well, sooner or later they're going to be a problem, because they're going to get big ideas. They're going to want the top job. So get them before they get you, especially if they're not a part of the family, which Chuck, for all his close workings with Tramiel, never was. For such a commandeering personality, Tramiel always seems frightfully insecure in his position. Maybe he was right to be with Gould breathing down his neck. Who knows? But for now we move on. It is worth noting though that in 1980 Jack had his second brush with death. His pet jet set on fire in the air and very nearly went down. This was hushed up at the time as Jack did not want such a near miss to affect Commodore's rising but still unstable stock price. To the next computer then, the VIC-20. Here's one of the most important figures involved in the genesis of the VIC-20. Yep, believe it or not. Not directly of course, but Jack Tramiel found inspiration for the VIC-20 in a trip to the UK and seeing the ZX80 in action. He was apparently quite surprised to see just what his former competitor in the calculator market was doing. While the PET did see some success in the UK, it was not a home computer. It cost over £1,000, a price that the average British home could ill afford back in the days of the 3-day week and winter of discontent. But then here's Clive, selling his microcomputers for £100, a price that many could happily afford, and there was to date no true American equivalent. Tramiel loved the idea of the ZX80 and wanted his own Sinclair killer. This was also the genesis of his most famous phrase, computers for the masses, not the classes. Now this was the true breakup with Chuck Peddle, who was pushing for an Apple killer, the TOI, a strong business computer that he wouldn't let go of despite Tramiel's indifference to it. After many arguments, Jack closed Chuck's Moorpark facilities and reduced his stand-in to nothing, reasserting to Chuck his status as the boss. Faced with Milton's desk in the basement, Peddle was out of there. Soon he would find his next company, Sirius, pounded into oblivion by Jack in the courtroom, and he would lose all his lucrative stock options at Commodore. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. The VIC-20 was built cheap and innovated nowhere. It was almost totally made up of stuff that Commodore already had. They already had the same BASIC that was in the PET, that's a given. The VIC stood for Video Interface Chip, which was something that another great Commodore engineer, Al Charpentier, had designed in 1977 and was a variation on the 6502, the 6560. The original idea was possibly for the chip to be used in a console or an arcade machine, but that never happened and it was shelved, until it was dredged up, barely upgraded, and shoved into the computer. Most of the other development was done at Commodore Japan under Tony Takai, where the computer was the VIC-1001, with the help of not only a great team of engineers, but a small software club that included none other than the future head of Nintendo, the late great Satoru Iwata. They created versions of Pac-Man and the like which were sold despite possible copyright concerns. In the end though, the VIC-20 came out in the US in the summer of 1981, inferior to most but not in price. At $300, it was $200 less than the Atari 800, its nearest competitor. Jack's instincts were correct. A lot of Americans were very hungry for a low-cost computer, and the VIC-20 was a roaring success, the first computer to sell over 1 million units in America. Of course, in order to do this, Jack Tramiel had to screw over a lot of people. In these days, every computer company had their trusted band of retailers, and computers were always sold in specialist shops. Makes sense, I mean, they cost so much, so it's a major purchase. You're going to want some expert advice on that, aren't you? Commodore, who'd always struggled in this department compared to the likes of Radio Shack, saw things another way. I mean, the computer's $300, the selling point is the price. Who the hell needs an expert for that? So the VIC-20 was the first computer to be sold on regular consumer store shelves, in particular Kmart. And suddenly the retailers are screwed. Someone can go to them, get all the advice they need, walk straight out and go to the big shop next door and buy the computer they want for a crap load cheaper. The whole way that computers are sold is changed forever. Or at least for the next couple of years. To call this a scorched earth tactic would be underselling it. Jack gathered the retailers, told every single one of them to fuck off, and replaced them all with William Shatner. The Shatner advertising campaign concentrated on the VIC-20 being more than just a games machine, capable of lots of business stuff, homework and all sorts. But hey, it played good games as well. And it's always good to have such a familiar face selling something that's on the shelves of your local supermarket. The VIC-20 for games wasn't anywhere near the capability of the Apple II or the Atari 800. But even so, the success of the machine meant that it would soon develop a neat little library of its own, and Jack and Commodore had no quibbles when it came to the folks publishing software on their machine, nor any pretensions as to what the computer should be used for. They spoke to both adults and kids equally, presenting an upstanding picture to the adults, while knowing what the kids really wanted. The VIC-20 is, no matter which way you look at it, an unqualified success. In the US micro story, it fills the role of the ZX80 and ZX81 combined. But is it enough? What's Commodore's blood rival doing? Actually, Texas Instruments' involvement in computers had already started in 1979, with the TI-99/4. On announcement, people predicted that TI would dominate computers just as they had done with calculators and consumer electronics in general. But it didn't work out that way. While the TI-99/4 was actually the first 16-bit computer on the market, it was beset by issues and a very expensive price. The former military giants had made a stuttering start, missing the mark with their first attempt and finding themselves outgunned, not by Commodore but by Apple, Atari and Radio Shack. But come the summer of 1981, they'd regrouped and rearmed themselves. The war was truly about to begin. Many thanks for watching this video, the first part of the Jack Tramiel saga. If you like the video then please do like it, do consider subscribing, following me on Facebook and Twitter, and supporting me on Patreon where you could find commentaries or a chance to get a tape every month, a Spectrum tape. Right, speaking of patrons, let's thank them now, there's a whole list of them. Jason Leach, Drew Briggs, Grayfen Blackpool, Ben Coker, Martin Pataki, Taylor Armand, Mark Johnston, Twisted Squote, Conformist, Jake Elwich, Horo Grizzly Bar, El O'Brien, Keith Barlow, Romeo, Peter Sidorn, Grant Butler, V. Shardy, Tiago Pereira dos Santos Silva, Olaf Allbean, Dragon Sexmaster, Joel Hartman, Phil Taprog, Jamie Hampshire, Lee Norris, Tim Lintz, Robert Kelly, James Halliday, Marco, Gianni Giacchetta, The Amigos Podcast, Richard Barrow, Hagenator, Radek, Ken Barraclough, Kenneth Bergen, Alvaro Gonzalez, Jamie Davenport, Johan Eriksson, Stephen Hornsby, Jan Best, Robin Banks, Dan Roscoe, Christian Earnshaw, Francisco Pimenta, Kev Gilmore, Alexander Green, Thomas Daniels, Greg Olson, Mark Johnson, Stuart Ashen, Lee Harris, James Idd, Novel, Gerard Morris, Mike Siegler, Mark Brooks, Edge Reader, Russell Hugo, Paolo Leary, Graham Kamak, Scott Mitten, Nicole Ketchum, Ninth Demon, Ludwig Holmstrom, and John Ezel. Thank you all so much for your brilliant contributions. I love you all, and thanks to all my patrons for just being brilliant, really. Join me next week for the second part of the Jack Tramiel saga, where we'll be getting right into the American War of the Home Computers, Commodore on one side, Texas Instruments on the other. But until then, it is as ever time to say goodbye, so wherever you are and whoever you be, have a good one, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.